I often get the question, how do you get better at music production? How do you just take on music production and really learn the ins and outs of it and use that information to become a better producer? So that was the question that I wanted to tackle today. I've written down a lot of different points that I want to talk about, so this is going to be a little bit of a longer, chaotic video. But I think all of the points that I'm going to make are very important for you to understand and to kind of get through. So what I would recommend for you to do is at least watch this video in its entirety at least once. There's going to be timestamps in the description, so you can look at the YouTube like play bar. And if you then ever want to get back to a subject, you can always just skip around back. But I do encourage you that you first time watching it, just sit down and watch the entire video in its entirety. That way everything that I will talk about throughout the whole video will become much clearer. Hey guys, I just wanted to quickly say, if you want to support this channel, go to my Spotify or Apple Music. There you can follow me and add some of my songs to your daily listening playlist. Thank you very much. Let's get back into the video. So I first want to go over some of the concepts that we generally use when we're talking about the different kinds of things that people want to learn in music production. There's mainly two things, and that is production and mixing. Production is the idea of creating sounds and creating a track, and mixing is the idea of taking those sounds, taking existing sounds and making them sound better, more cohesive with each other, and just overall like gluing them together into one cohesive song. Some people might argue that mastering is different from that, in that you're working on the final song. I personally think that mastering is basically so close related to mixing that you could see it as one process, but it's usually the final process, and often in productions, even for my own productions, it is a separate phase from mixing. So I would argue that they're kind of related, so close that you could almost call them the same thing, but they're definitely two different things. So in production, there's a lot of different things that you need to worry about. Obviously, it's not just taking sounds and making a track out of it. It's melody writing, it's writing chords, it is expressing feelings, those kind of things, those almost abstract things. But I want to go over three different points that I think are very important, especially more for the sidetrance related field. Obviously, this video is for any genre. You could apply this to any genre, but I want to stay focused a little bit on sidetrance because that's what I do here on this channel. So the 3 points that I see most people having trouble with are theming, sound design, and tension. And I'll explain all three briefly. But I have done videos on some of them, mainly sound design, and I have done a lot of sound design videos in the past. And I have a video coming on tension, which is a video that's going to take a while to make because it's also going to include a sample pack, which takes a long time to make. I've talked about this before, the sample pack that I'm working on together with that video. It's just a very big project that takes a long time to actually finish. So for that reason, that's something I'll go into later. So yeah, but let's start with theming. So theming, what it is everything that is memorable about a track. So that could be a catchy melody, that could be a specific vocal line, that could be an instrument that stands out, that could be a rhythm that is specific to your track, although the latter one is a little bit harder to find. Lately, a lot of rhythms have been explored and there isn't really a lot of variation that can be done that also just sounds nice. But all those kind of things, everything about the production that can stand out could be a theme for the track. So theming is important because it allows your track to stand out, and not only is that important in marketing and just memorability, making sure that people recognize your track, those kind of things. It is also important in the sense of production. When you're working on a production, it is key that you get excited about the production, that you actually feel the kind of song that you're working on. And theming really helps there because it makes the track more memorable. So even when you're not strictly producing at it, it will still help you remember the song. Maybe you can get some ideas while you're not at your computer, and because you're remembering the song that you're working on. So for that reason, theming is also important. What I personally would say is that well-themed tracks generally tend to tell a much deeper story than tracks that don't have a lot of theming. This is mainly the case with vocals. Vocals are very strong in this kind of idea because obviously you can tell a very cool story with vocals. You can really go in depth on how you want the listener to feel, how you want the listener to react to your song. And that's something that is, in my opinion, very important for a song to do, is to make people happy or make people feel a certain way, whatever you want to do. It is very important that you take that expression that you want to give to people, the kind of storytelling that you want to tell, and actually theme your track in such a way that that story is being told properly. So you could say when you're working on a project that there's several types of theming. You would have, if your project is maybe an EP or a whole album, you could say that might be an overarching theme to the whole album or the whole EP. Then you would go a little bit more in depth and you would say, okay, how is each song themed? How does the song fit into the overarching theme? But also, what exactly is each song talking about? A little bit more individually looking at each song of a project. Obviously, for a single, that overarching theme doesn't really exist. You would only be looking at the theme of the individual song. But then going a little bit more in depth, you can also say for each song, where in the song are the different parts of the theme explored or explained to the listener. So you could almost say that different sections of a song have different little sub-themes that all sit below the main theme of the whole song. This last one is especially important when you're writing with like a singer or a song that just has like a vocal line on it, where somebody is singing throughout the whole song. There, what you generally want is that the vocals kind of develop the story. In that case, you would need to know for your song how is the story of your song when the song is starting, and at the end of the song, what is the difference in the story, and how do we progress from whatever we have at the start of the song towards the end of the song. So that's a little bit about theming. I've talked about theming in the past, so if you want to, I will leave some resources in the description about that. I will leave as many resources as I can throughout this video. So be definitely on the lookout for either the cards or the description or the comments wherever I post them. And you'll be able to find more resources that I've created about the different topics that I talk about. So the next concept that people tend to struggle with is tension. That's a concept which really kind of defines an energy level for the track. And the track kind of moves between different levels of energy. Generally speaking, what you want when you're working on any production is that there are kind of like climaxes, and you're building up to a climax, and then you have the big moment, and then you turn down the energy level so that people can kind of recover from that much energy. You would never really want a track that is just full on energy all the way through, because what happens then is that not one of the moments in your track really stands out, and it's better to have a few moments that really stand out and therefore other moments that are a little bit more dull, so you're creating a contrast, rather than a track that is full energy all the way through. When talking about energy, it's a little bit hard to define. It's usually a combination of like musical energy, where through the use of different chords and different melodies, you're building up to kind of a musical climax, as well as in production, what you would usually have is some kind of automation, where different parameters of different effects are automated to create more tension and to create this feeling of a rise in energy or a fall in energy, whatever you're working on. But there is no real one way to formulate energy. Some people might define it a little bit different than others, but it is definitely something that you need to take a look at, is how is my song transitioning from one phase to the other. For example, you might be somebody that divides up their track into different pieces. A lot of people tend to do that. You usually have an intro, a verse, and a chorus in regular pop songs. For psytrance songs, we have an intro, then we have a pre-drop, and then we tend to have the first drop, which is usually divided into little subsections of drop, and the energy levels between those subsections tend to differ a lot. So we need to think about, okay, going from a section which is relatively low energy to a higher energy, how am I going to transition? Am I going to use any risers? Am I going to use any automation? Am I going to use any other effects? Am I going to use any musical approaches? Am I going to do like a key change or whatever? Or am I just going to pitch some stuff up, having like a pitch riser on some of the elements in your track? There's a lot of different things that you can do that can contribute to the energy. Overall volume is also one of them. By raising the volume, it's going to be louder and therefore tends to be more energetic. But there's too much to just get into for this little segment, so I will leave it there. Again, as I said, I'm going to do a much bigger video on Tension alone, a video like this where I explore a lot more of the concepts. So if you're not already subscribed and you find that interesting, subscribe to the channel so you won't miss that video when it comes out eventually. The final concept of production that people tend to struggle with is sound design, and usually not the kind of sound design where you're designing a sound that you've already heard, but more the kind of sound design where you're creating sounds that have never been heard. Usually we say that it's your sound, your own sound as an artist, something special about your music that not a lot of other people do. It's usually in the synthesis part or the sound generation part where we're talking about. It's usually not something that has to do with effects, although that can sometimes also be the case. So when I say people struggle with sound design, what I really mean is that they struggle kind of with the creating their original sound. A lot of people tend to listen to tracks and draw inspiration in such a way that they're kind of copying other producers. And in terms of learning, that's fine. But if you really want to step up your production game, you need to find a way that your productions differ from other productions. And that means that you need to spend a lot of time creating sounds, experimenting with sounds, and just finding a few different techniques that you can apply that you know that maybe a lot of other people don't know, so that you can use those techniques to create sounds that other people cannot create. So to quickly recap, the three concepts that people struggle with is theming, which is the art of making your track memorable. We have tension, which is dividing the energy of the track over the whole track and seeing how those energy levels kind of evolve throughout the whole song. And then we have sound design, which is kind of the art of creating sounds in a way that make your tracks unique from any other tracks that you might have heard. So now I want to talk about the mixing process, which is usually a process that comes after the production. Generally what tends to happen is that people pretty clearly divide first their production phase, and then their mixing phase, and then their mastering phase. So the mixing phase, what it really is taking all of the elements that you have created in the production phase and gluing them together into one song. And generally speaking, how I like to approach this is to take that whole process of the mixing process and turn it into a bunch of smaller processes. So I actually have 4 processes that I do. I first do a level mix, then I do an EQ mix, then I do a stereo mix, and finally I tweak any effects that maybe have a wrong setting, which I have applied in the production phase. The way I work is that during the production phase, I already kind of tend to head towards the mixing phase, in the sense that I create some of the effects that I already want, like usually a lot of delays and a lot of reverbs. Because in psytrance, delays are very important, and it tends to be that you have a very short sound and then a very long delay tail. So I consider things like delays, reverbs, and even some creative EQing or even some tonal EQing already part of the production phase rather than the mixing phase. But for those effects, what I do is once I've done my volume mix, my EQ mix, and my stereo mix, I revisit all of those effects to see if they're still the way that I want them to be. But there can be a lot more effects that you might need to revisit after the first stages of the mixing process. There might be some distortion, there might be some saturation, which is lighter distortion. There might be some creative effects that are causing you problems at certain parts of the tracks that you need to revisit. There might be some tonal EQ that you again would need to do, or some creative EQ if you're doing like filter modulation, those kind of things. You might have to revisit those things as well at the end of the mixing phase, just to make sure that they're all set correctly and doing what they want within the new mix that you've created once you did the first 3 processes, the level mix, the EQ mix, and then the stereo mix. So I quickly want to go over those 3 first processes with what they are. The names are very self-explanatory. The level mix, what it is you basically mix the track by only using the volume sliders. So you're setting the volume of the individual elements and you don't touch anything else. The EQ mix, what you do is you go through each of the tracks and see if all of the frequencies are sitting right. And usually this is done within the context of a whole mix. You generally want to EQ elements when the whole track is playing, so you know what frequency spectrum that you're working with of the whole mix. And then your goal is to take the individual sound and place it in the spectrum in such a way that it fits well. This is also the phase where you look at if there's any rumblings in the track, if there's any like low bass that doesn't need to be there, or if there's a lot of high end that doesn't need to be there, then this is the moment where you kind of cut that out and make sure that that's not an issue. Even resonant frequencies, if you have some frequencies that resonate too high, then you would need to turn them down in this phase. Finally, there's stereo mixing, which is a little bit less self-explanatory. In that case, what you're talking about is how do the sounds fit in the stereo field. So we talked about the spectrum before in the last phase. Now we're looking at the stereo field. So you might use stereo wideners, you might use panning, you might use stereo expanders and contractors. Plugins like Ozone Imager are often used here, which is just used to make sure how wide are certain frequencies of certain sounds within the mix. And generally speaking, background sounds tend to be a little bit wider, whereas the main elements tend to be a little bit more mono. So they sit in the front of the mix. So now that we've looked at some of the issues with the main production process of producing a sound, I want to actually show you what you kind of need when producing a sound. For that, I'm going to go into my project file and kind of show you how I've set it up. This is not going to be a full overview of my template or anything. Again, resources for that are in the description or in the cards or in the comments, wherever I post them. But yeah, I kind of want to just go over some simple setups that you can do to make your workflow more efficient and therefore allow you to quickly learn and improve your music production as well. So first, I want to talk about kind of the plugins that you need. There's a lot of discussion in terms of how many plugins do you need, which plugins do you need, how much do you need to spend on it, or can you just make fine music with free ones? And the truth is that usually paid plugins tend to be higher in quality, in sound quality, than free plugins. But that's not always like a golden rule. There might be some paid plugins that do a job very poorly, or there might be some free plugins that sound amazing. But generally speaking, the chance that a plugin does what it's supposed to do and also sounds good is higher when the price is a little bit higher. But that doesn't mean that you cannot make great music using only free plugins, or even without using plugins, just using the effects that your DAW has to offer. For me, I've collected a lot of plugins over the years. So here's my plugins folder. This is my VST folder. The one or the few things that are of interest here is this effects rack here. These are all the effects that I have installed, and here I have all the instruments that I have installed. You can see Serum, Vital, and then we also have another instrument that I use is Faceplant, which I've just placed in its own little folder here. So any of the kilohertz stuff is in its own little folder. In terms of effects, what I have is I have some random effects that are very specific. So this is a guitar amp, for example. Here we have very specific EQ that I kind of use as a one-trick pony, but I do use it a lot. My main suite of effects is this Melda plugins here, which is just a whole bunch of different plugins from Melda Productions, which make great plugins. There's some other stuff here as well, with Syscope, which is a free oscilloscope. Here we have some plugins from Reaper. We have Signalizer, which is another analyzer. Some stuff from Sound Toys as well. Valhalla makes some cool free stuff. My general approach with free plugins is that it's always good to have, but I wouldn't like have it too many of them in terms of like clutter. What might be the case if you have too many plugins is that you spend a lot of time searching for the right plugin, whereas it's usually better to have a few plugins that you know very well, so that you can get a wide range of sounds out of the different plugins that you do have. But there might be some specific plugins that you kind of look over. For example, this EQ here, which is like a one-trick pony for you. And in that case, it's always good to have, so that you have like one extra trick up your sleeve. And if you're just using it for that and you don't spend any other time with it, then it might still be justifiable to just have that plugin in your folder. What I do recommend for everybody is that they have kind of like a smaller list of plugins that they use on a daily basis. So this is my list here. This is a small list of plugins that I tend to use a lot. You can see a whole bunch of different plugin creators here that I use, and a whole bunch of different instruments down below as well. And this is kind of like the list that I have always open, and if I need something specific, I will dive into here and get it from here. I also have some VST3 things here. Again, some very specific things like this Dear VR Micro, which if I open it up, I can show you is a plugin which is really specific to what it does, in that it takes a sound and it's not only applying left-right panning, but also back and front kind of panning, in the sense that it takes a sound and it makes it sound up front, before the listener or behind the listener, and it's using some really weird DSP stuff to do this. So therefore it's not something that you can apply to any sound, but it's also something that you won't apply to any situation. There's not a lot of situations where you're mixing a sound in almost like surround sound setting, but in stereo. So to recap, when it comes to plugins, it's better to have a few plugins that you know well and then a few one-trick ponies than a very large quantity of plugins that you all use sporadically and that you don't have one plugin that you really know deep inside, right? So I do want to recommend some categories of plugins where I would recommend that you have at least one of those plugins in that category to create good music. The first one is a good delay unit. I would recommend at least one, but preferably a few, that you can still maybe choose a few different flavors or sound. The ones that I have at the current moment that I really like is here this H delay from Waves, which is a very cool plugin. And then I also have, I think it might be not in here. I do need to update this list, so that will be in here. Would be the Soundboys Echo Boy Junior or Soundtoys Echo Boy Junior here. And this is a very cool one because it has a few different algorithms that you can use. But if none of the algorithms of Echo Boy works for me, then I'll usually go to this other here, this other plugin, the H delay by Waves. So those are my two go-to like color delays, almost you would say. If I need a very specific delay that is very clean, I'd rather go to the delays from the Melda Production stuff. Melda Production tends to be very clean overall. There's not a lot of coloring of the sound going on, not a lot of saturation. So for any clean application, I'll usually use Melda plugins. My second recommendation is a good reverb. Again, I have a few that I use, but they might not work for you. This is really the point where you have to look at plugins yourself, download a bunch of demos, see which ones sound best for you, and then use those. It is not a good idea to just copy over what I am doing, just because you see me doing it. So the one that I have here is H delay, again within the same theme of Waves. I got these two plugins in a deal, a Black Friday deal recently. The other one that I have, which I really like, is M Turbo Verb. This is one of the few plugins from Melda that does a lot of coloring. Obviously a reverb plugin does do a lot of coloring, but here what I like about it is that you have all these different modes that you can see. There's a lot of different kind of modes in here, and then each mode has its own little like sub mode section, so you can see whichever one I click, there's like a few different sub modes for that. And then you can still tweak a lot of parameters and stuff like that. So even though this plugin is very big, you can see there's a lot of different modes. This is still kind of almost like the parameter edit mode, in the sense that it's like a simplified mode. If you go here in this edit button, you can edit individual reflections of the early reverb or the late reverb. You can see here the formulas used and the parameters used and stuff like that. And you can modify all of this about your reverb. So you can really dive into it, and this is where I use, if I want to dial in a very specific reverb for a sound, then I'll use this. But otherwise, I'm either using just the browser, or I am using my H reverb long version or the normal version. The next recommendation that I have is that you have one very high quality EQ. For that, again, I use the Melda plugins. So they come with a whole bunch of different EQs here. You can see the ones that I tend to use the most are the normal dynamic EQ and their linear phase EQ, which is general linear phase EQ. There's also a whole bunch of different other EQs that you can use. But what's important is that you have one EQ that can do both normal phase as well as linear phase. The reason why that's important, if you go into bass production, especially in psytrance, it is often the case that linear phase tends to sound a little bit better and create a little bit cleaner waveforms and therefore cleaner bass lines. But in general, if you're working with a lot of bass frequencies, then linear phase is definitely something that you want to consider. So therefore you want to have it just that you can compare a setting with linear phase and without linear phase to each other to see how that impacts the sound. The other thing that's important with these EQs is just that the quality of the EQ is high. A lot of people say that you can use stock EQs, but there's definitely been experiments done that just goes to show that they tend to cram a lot with high frequencies, that they tend to distort a lot with high frequencies and just generally sound unpleasant in the high frequencies, including the one from Ableton, but I also know that the one from Reverb. Dan Warrell did 2 videos on those, explaining why they're not the best options and that there are better options out there. He compared it to FabFilter's EQs, which is a brilliant series of EQs. I unfortunately don't use those. I've gone for the Melda plugins instead, but they basically do the same thing. Everything that you can see here can probably be done with the Melda or the FabFilter EQ as well. So if you have that, then you should already be okay in terms of EQing. The next kind of mixing plugin that I would recommend is that you have one really good compressor that you know well. I have a few. Again, here in the Dynamics tab, there's a lot of compressors that I use. I use the multiband Dynamics one, this M Dynamics, which isn't multiband capable, but still capable of very nice compression. And as you can see, it comes with actually 2 compressors in one, so you can dial in 2 different compression styles and then just use those. You can see here how that would work. You can see one compression here and then the other processor taking over as well. So you can dial in really creative curves with this as well. If I want a bit more character, I'll either go for the M Turbo Comp here, which tries to emulate some of the more famous compressors out there. But if that's not good enough, I also have, again, from Waves, this CLA compressor here, which has either the blue version or the black version of the 76 compressor, which is a famous, I believe, mostly vocal compressor, but it also works well on drums for me. And there's a lot of nice settings that you can dial in with this emulation as well. What I also like is one plugin that is capable of a multiband. Again, I usually use the M Dynamics here. That's just because default preset opens up with no processing going on at all. So I can easily set up a multiband split if I want to. What I mean by that is what you would do is apply different effects to different frequencies, which is often what you want in mixing. So here I'm going to set up a quick 3-way multiband split. How you do that is by just soloing individual bands of the different plugins. And then here you select the high band, and now you can, for example, take a distortion unit, like for example the overdrive, and only apply it to the high frequencies of your sound. And now once you've done this, what you can, for example, do is take an overdrive and only apply overdrive to the high frequencies of your sound. So this is where a multiband plugin comes in, not just for the multiband processing it can do itself, but it also allows you to take specific plugins that aren't multiband capable. So for example, I would be able to take, let's say, the Waves Reverb and apply that just to the mid-range, for example. So now this is applying just to the mid-range of the sound, which without multiband processing, you wouldn't be able to do that easily. Another recommendation that you should probably look into is some plugins to control stereo. I would recommend one imager plugin. So that would be, in my case, M Stereo Processor. What this allows you to do is take 4 different bands and set the width of each of the bands. So I can set the width of, for example, all the bass frequencies, and I can set the high frequencies to be wider. And in this case, it also comes with a slight saturator and an overall width control. So this plugin is very good for just controlling the stereo field of a sound. Another thing that you're going to need in that case is something to generate stereo. So for that, I recommend you have a few different plugins that are capable of generating stereo. For me, this is M Stereo Generator, M Stereo Spread, and then I also have from Waves or from X for Records the Dimension Expander, which is also used often to create stereo width to a sound. And this one is free, so I definitely recommend that you get it. But you would need to see for yourself which kind of stereo effects that you like on different sounds and which effect you use to generate stereo. The important thing is once you have a sound that is stereo, that you can also control it. So I would highly recommend that you get at least one imager. I know that Ozone's imager also does this exact same thing. So that's also an option that you can use. Otherwise, if you have a different multiband capable plugin and you used the trick before with Splitter, in Ableton what you can do is you can use the utility effect to set the width of individual frequencies that way. So you can basically build your own version of this. And I believe I have even done that. If we go to my audio effects rack, there should be a stereo control rack here, which does this exact same thing. Instead of 4 bands, it's 3 bands. And you can set individual crossovers here of the different bands and set exciters. So that would be a slight saturator, as well as just the overall width of those bands. So you would, for example, set something like this. I have done a video on all of these effect racks because this is part of a group. So I'll leave that in the resources that I mentioned as well. So you can find that and play around with not only this stereo control if you're using Ableton, but also some other effects racks as well. Finally, the last category of plugins that I would recommend that you have at least one of, preferably more, is some distortion and saturation. So for me, again, I tend to use some of the Melda stuff here. So that would be this series. A lot of the multi-band stuff is a lot of fun. I also have digital distortion, so that would be ambit fun. But I also recently got, again from Waves, these stereo or mono guitar distortion units. So this is a screamer, a overdrive, and finally we have a fuzz distortion as well. So these again are all also 3 different distortion units that I've been using lately a lot. And I recommend that you use a few different kind of flavors and a few different plugins to dial in your distortion, because there's some distortion that works on one type of sound and there's other distortions that just sound better on other sounds. So having a little bit of choice at least is good. Again, not in the principle of having 50 different distortion units, because we talked about it before, that you don't want too many plugins doing the same thing. In this case, what I would say is that you just want a selection of maybe 5 or 6 that you know a little bit better than you would if you were to have a selection of 50. So now that we have the plugins out of the way, let's talk a little bit about samples. So for me, what I recommend is that you have basically 2 folders. I know people tend to hoard samples like crazy. I am definitely one of those people. And here are all of the sample packs that I very occasionally use. So you can see a very large collection of sample packs. And then I have the favorites here, which when I turn this down, you can see is just a bunch of smaller sample packs usually. These are very tiny. There's a few ones that are a little bit bigger. For example, the Sounds of Kashmir is definitely a bigger sample pack here. But these are the main sample packs that I use in my productions right now. So this is a very dynamic folder. If one sample pack falls out of favor, I'll just take it out and put it in this one. So I always have it somewhere, and Ableton can always find the samples that I'm missing. But this is basically the folder that when I'm actually working on a production, this is the folder that's always open. I sometimes do, when I'm looking for something very specific, go back into this folder here, but 90% of the samples that I use, maybe even more, comes from these sample packs here. So for synths and presets, I'm going to bundle those together. It's again important that you know the ones that you have well, rather than having very many synths or very many presets that you don't really know well. So in this case, I'll show you my Serum. Serum is the only synth that I have presets for. So these are the newer packs that I use on a day-to-day basis. Here are all of the older presets that I haven't used before, and there's some other ones as well here. You can see a lot more presets here as well. Again, this is older stuff. So I generally when I'm looking for presets, I'm looking in these folders. So you can see about, I would say 300 presets, maybe a bit more. There is some more stuff in here as well. So maybe 300, 350 presets. Again, same with wavetables. I have my own pack of wavetables here, which is 229. And then I have these wavetables as well that I tend to use. And then all of the older wavetables sit within this list. So they're kind of hidden, not really in view here. And they're definitely in a different folder than any of the ones that I actively use. So that is just for me for organization, and I would recommend you do the same, that you still have your large backup of whatever weird wavetables or presets that you might want to use in the future. But if you're actively looking for a preset or something, or actively looking for a wavetable here, in this case in Serum, you have just very few options to choose from, so you can get to that next step of the music writing process earlier than that you were spending listening to 100 different presets as opposed to a few thousand. So I want to talk about some of the other things that you might want to have in your production environment. I first talk about two things here in Ableton, and then I'll mention something else outside of Ableton. But these things I'm pretty sure can be done in other DAWs as well. So the first thing, which I'm almost 100% sure any DAW can do, is just a random folder where you can store different things, different ideas. Here you can see there's a whole bunch of different samples, random lead sounds. These are clips. So there's sounds generated by a synth with automation already in there. So you can see it's a MIDI clip, which also loads with a synth, and you can even save automation and stuff this way. But you can also have, as you can see, this ALS file, which is a full project, which is just a track that you draw in here, which again, instead of it being a clip, you can have multiple clips. So you can have multiple different ideas. Here you can see there's a few different clips, and there's automation. When you scrub through, you can see the automation here playing out and changing over time. So this is one of those folders where I just place a whole bunch of different things that I might need in the future, maybe not. There's a bunch of different folders. There's some MIDI stuff, a whole bunch of different things in there, which are basically not something that I would save somewhere else. When I'm looking for specific things that I've made, what I'm doing is I'm placing it in here. Again, here there are some random things in there as well, but these are also all the sample packs that I'm working on. So this is the transition sample pack that I mentioned before. As you can see, a whole bunch of risers in here, which I use in productions as well. So that's really useful. We have downlifters here, and I still need to make them for the other ones here. There's a little bit, but not enough. And then here I need to make other things as well. So you can see there's still a lot of work that I need to do on this sample pack before it's finished. But this is the folder that I use for like organized things that I want to save, whereas this random music stuff is there for the kind of random things that I don't really have a place for. The final thing is this Ableton track folder. Now you see that I already, when my project opens like this, there's a lot of tracks here that already sit in the project, but there might be a few different ones that I want to add to it as well. So for example, here we have the routing groups. I also have that saved as a track. I have SizeScope, which is a plugin that I often use to analyze my kick and bass. And this opens up as a group, and it has the plugin already on there, and the track for the kick and a track for bass lines to enter, and it's already set up to work. So it's just easy for me if I want to use SizeScope, instead of having to set up a group like this, which I would normally do. You can just set it up like this, say, okay, we'll set this to be the kick. We'll take the bass line and go to basses, for example. In this case, that would be the number 24, but I don't see it here showing up. So you would take it from there. And now SizeScope already has those inputs working, and it allows me to continue on producing, and it just saves me a lot of time, which means that I can spend less time organizing my project and spend more time being creative. So those are all the tools inside Ableton that I wanted to talk about. The final thing is that I generally recommend that you have a list of tutorials, mainly sound design tutorials, of sounds that you find interesting or mixing techniques that you find interesting. and just have that on YouTube. I do have a playlist like that, but obviously mine is private for me. I highly recommend that you make your own and not copy somebody else's, because it is more personalized to you, and you might have some sounds that you like that I don't like, and I have some sounds that I like that you might not like. So in that case, it should be a personalized list for you, so that you can easily look for the specific sounds that you're looking for, or the specific mixing techniques that you're looking for, or just the specific ideas. What I do recommend in that case is that you look at tutorials only, and not like tip videos and those kind of things. Something that you can open up, like I have a problem and here's a solution for that problem. Generally speaking, tip videos, what they do is they pack a whole bunch of different tips into one video. Not that that's not helpful. I definitely enjoy some good tip videos, because they tend to be more of the kind of video that I watch when I have a creative blockade. But in this case, what I'm talking about is a specific list of almost like a problem solution list, where if you have a problem, then you can watch that video to get the solution. And for me, all of my tutorials are in the description down below. There should be a link to the playlist of them. If not, there should be a link in the cards. I'm certain that it's there. So if it's not in the description, look in the cards. And if you have a few problems that you see can be solved by my videos, I would recommend adding those to the list to begin with. But you can also add other videos as well, obviously, just to, have a little bit of a catalog of solutions to potential problems that you might run into while you're producing. So now that you kind of know what you all need to have to improve your music, I want to kind of get into the workflow, how you actually work with all the tools that you have, and some of the things that you can do to improve the process of actually writing music. So these are a bunch of ideas that I want you to kind of apply while you're working. And not only that, this is something that you would need to specifically look out for when you're working on it. So when you're just chilling and writing music, this wouldn't be something to do. But when you're actively trying to learn, this is the kind of mindset that I would recommend you have while working on music. So the first idea that I want you to try is to divide your sound design process up into different steps. Usually people think of something like Serum as a whole package, in the sense that it's generating the tones, it is generating the filtering, it's generating all of the movement, and it also usually includes all of the effects. And for me, what I like more is to have a workflow where, for example, I'll have all of the sound generation happen by Serum, and some of the movement as well, and then I'll have maybe some of the filtering done by a specific EQ setup or specific filter plugin setup, and then I'll have each of the plugins after that in the chain perform a single action that I want to apply. That way, anytime I'm working on a sound, I have a whole bunch of like stages that I go through. So I will start with the tone of the sound, then I'll do the modulation and the filtering, and then I'll say, okay, now I want a delay. I'll close out of Serum, and then I'll just think for a minute, what kind of delay do I want on this sound? I'll look for the right plugin for that, and then I'm in the mindset of designing the delay sound for that particular sound that I'm working on. Then next I'll say, okay, I need a reverb. I'll close out of the delay, say, okay, which reverb do I want? What kind of sound am I going for? And then I'll look up the reverb and set up the reverb in the exact way that I want for that sound. This way, you're much less tempted to just take, for example, turn on the delay in Serum and say, okay, this is delay, that's good enough for me. It kind of forces you to spend some time at least with the delay sound, or with only the delay of the sound that you're working on. And that obviously also includes for reverb and any other effects that you're using. This also means that your project is a little bit more modular, in the sense that if you have a few lead sounds that you want to apply the same delay to, instead of having to copy over the settings within Serum from instance of Serum to the other instance of Serum, or maybe even between different synths if you're using multiple instruments. Instead, what you can do is just take one of those delays and just apply it to all of the tracks throughout, for example, group, or just by copying them over to each individual track. It's a little bit more modular, and you don't have to dive into the synth to copy over the different delay settings. Instead, you just have one delay that you can, as I said, copy over, and it's a lot quicker and just also a lot easier. Even if you want to tweak it later, you don't have to tweak multiple delays and instead can just tweak one of them. What I also want you to do is kind of always have a goal for a certain action. So if you're going to apply an EQ effect to a sound, I want you to, before you do that, already know why you're EQing that sound and what you're planning to do when you finally have the EQ loaded in. And this is something that you can think of already a few phases before. So let's say that you're working on the sound, you just have the synth part ready, you say, okay, I'm going to add a delay and an EQ. While you're tweaking that delay, you can already think about the EQ as well. Maybe there's some weird stuff happening in the delay that you need to EQ out, some frequencies overlapping and resonating in weird ways might be something that you need to consider. So as I said, what this also does is that it kind of links actions to certain effects or certain processes that you use. So for example, I'm adding an EQ because I want to add some high end. From that point on, you're always going to associate adding some high end with an EQ. Now there might be more ways than one to do that, but if you're say, I'm going to add some saturation to add some high end, there must be a difference between why you're choosing an EQ and why you're choosing a saturation unit. And that difference can help you in the future make better decisions whether you want to use an EQ or a saturation unit. So by associating actions to effects and plugins and different processes, it allows you when in the future you need to again do a certain process of use a certain effect, make you make better choices in the sense of what effect to use and what process to use to achieve a certain goal again. The next idea to try, I'll show you in Ableton because it's just a little bit better to show it like this, is to be very analytical in the sense that use a lot of analyzers. What that allows you to do, especially if you're not in a well-treated room or you're working with very good speakers like I am, what that allows you to do is just be a little bit more analytical and therefore have to rely a little bit less on your ears. Now I say a little bit because your ears are definitely the main thing that you should be working with, even when you're doing like an analytical approach to music production. But what it can do is spot some details that you might not be able to hear on your system. So for example, some of the analyzers that I use is one is this master record, which allows me to see the waveform of what I'm producing. This is one very good to go into details, so like really zooming in on the particular sound, and instead of using an oscillator or a waveform display, I can just have it still in the project and I can see what's going on. I can even like zoom if I want to, and it just goes away whenever I need to have it hidden away. The second thing that I have is a whole bunch of analyzers here on my master channel. So this is a normal spectrum analyzer, which I can open up like this and I can really dive into the spectrum if I want to. I also have a whole bunch of analyzers here, which is the signalizer package, which if we open these up completely, show me in order the stereo analysis. We have a waterfall display, which is spectrum over time. And here we have a waveform display, which shows the waveform over 1 second. So this is different than the one that I have down here below, in that this one like moves along, whereas this one is static. And finally here we have a spectrum analyzer. Again, same thing as this thing here. But I just have it open up the whole package. So stereo, waveform, waterfall and spectrum. And I have that on a separate monitor here on your left. You could see it drag me in first. Finally here I have a multi-analyzer, which is really useful for collisions. This shows where certain frequencies are colliding or playing at the same time, as well as showing different waveforms of the different elements that I have in my track. And this is set up in a way where any drums that I add to the drum group will automatically show up in the drum analyzer here, and therefore it will show up on the drum spectrum, the drum waveform, the drum stereo here, drum collisions, the sonogram, which again is, I believe, a waterfall display. There's a lot of different analyzers that I sometimes use, and these are really for the details. But what I want you to do is try to, if you're not already doing this, use a little bit more analyzers to see if you can spot some details in your track, some maybe mistakes or issues with the mixing, or some issues with your sound design, or overall collisions between different frequencies, stuff like that, that you can iron out using these analyzers. Now this approach is a little bit hard to get used to. It definitely takes some time to learn all your analyzers and learn the different tools that you're working with. But again, I think it's worth it because there might be some problems that you cannot spot with just your ears alone. So it's definitely something to get used to. In that same realm, what you would need to do is run some reference tracks through the analyzers as well. Again, I would also recommend doing this just normally, in the sense that just listening to reference tracks is a good idea to hear what reference material sounds like on your system, but also having a reference track and looking at what is happening in, for example, the spectrum or the stereo is a good way to understand how your genre that you're producing should sound, as opposed to how your track is actually sounding at this moment. So that allows you to see the differences and how you need to fix almost your mix or your master or your production or whatever to get more in line with this genre. Obviously, I'm not trying to advocate that you should always do this. It might be sometimes a good idea to stay away from some of the conventions within your genre if you're trying to experiment with something new. But usually most of the time, especially with mixing, there are some few conventions that there are for a reason, just because they, generally speaking, make your track sound better. So that it's always a good idea to still keep looking at those things. So one of the approaches that I already talked about, which I also think it would be a good idea to implement, is the four-stage mixing approach, where you first look at the levels, then you look at the EQ, then you look at the stereo, and then you would look at all the creative effects. So you're looking at all the volume sliders, then you're looking at the spectrum, all the frequencies of the sounds, then you're looking at how they are placed in the stereo field. And then once all of those things are done, you should look again at all of your effects, if they still make sense, if the settings are still correct, and if there are not any settings that are overdone or underdone. Usually the biggest culprits in this case would be delays and reverbs. For them, you generally speaking need to retweak them a lot once like the mixing phase is done. For the next approach, before we get into that, I do want to say that I am generally speaking somebody who advocates for spending a lot of time finishing different projects rather than spending a lot of time finishing one project. The goal of spending multiple projects is to get you familiar with the whole production phase of a song. So if you spend a lot of time making ideas but never finishing an idea, you'll be very bad relative to other producers who have made a lot of ideas in terms of like finishing a track, also delivering a track, or maybe even publishing a track if you intend to publish the music that you create and release it. Those are all skills that you need to develop as an artist, and you're not going to develop those skills if you never encounter them. So if you're never getting to the master stage, you will not be a very good mastering engineer for your work. With that being said, I do want to recommend that at least once in a while you spend like a whole session working on the details of your track, really diving into the very little things that is happening in your track, seeing if you can really nail everything the way that you want it. This is just a good exercise to do every once in a while to maybe make you a little bit more fluent with your processes that you use. It's also a good way to experiment with new effects, experiment with different functionalities in the plugins that you're using. Stuff like that really tends to happen when you're really focused on the little things of your track, really the details of your track. Finally, again, going back into Ableton here, the last thing that I want to talk about is project organization. Throughout this whole video, we have talked a lot about the different ways I've organized things, not just samples, but also plugins here. But also you can see the template is already laid out for me to work on and start producing immediately. And I definitely stick to the template. I can show you that by opening up a project that I'm working on. So here is a project that I'm currently working on, and you can see that everything is organized within these 6 groups. So I definitely know where everything is. Once I'm getting close to the mixing phase, what I'll do is I'll name all of these tracks as well, so I know exactly what is happening where in the track. Right now in the production phase, I'm just trying to get all of the sounds down, and once I get into the mixing part, I'll name all of these things so that I definitely know what is happening in my project as well. This is very important because As you can see, this project here, 120, more than 120 tracks, and it's still not finished. You can see I still need to write the last part of the song. So there's going to be added at least another 20 to 30 tracks here. So when you're working with 100 and let's say 110 tracks or even more, then organization becomes really important. And even with smaller projects, it's such a waste of time having to look for a sound within your project. And again, the same thing that applies to the plugins as well as the samples. Having an organization that works well for you just improves your workflow to a point where you have to worry less about the looking for things and figuring out how your project works, or how your sample pack setup works, or how your plugin organization works, or your preset organization, or any of those things work. And it allows you to spend more time on the actual music writing and creative part of music production. So another thing that I want to show in terms of organization is that I use a lot of these helper tracks here. We have this track here which details the structure of the song. So each of these colors is a different section, and we have an intro, a pre-drop, a drop here, a little fill, we have a breakdown, another pre-drop here, we have an outro, and we have a fade out. So all of those things are organized. So in terms of when I'm zoomed in like this, I can always see, for example, okay, the fill is here, even if I'm like very zoomed into the lead sounds, and I might not be able to see that from the drums or the pads or something. I can zoom up and I can just see, okay, I'm in a fill, for example, here. So it's an easy way for me to always be able to see where I am in a track. And it allows me to just scroll up and get a sense of the structure of my track. So that's also a kind of organization that just allows you to work a little bit quicker. And another example of that is, for example, if I open up an EQ here, I'll do this on a new audio track so you can see what's actually happening. Just for now, I'll make a little bit of a mess here. Most of the things that I want to do are already present. So I have a low pass here, I have a high pass which I can engage and is already set up. I have a high shell that I can work with, which is at the sensible range. I have some bells which are already set up at a sensible range, right? And this allows me to already work with an EQ and just easily move the different notes around and set up an EQ thing. Now, if I were to have all of these disabled, it takes you, let's say, half a second to turn those on again. But if this is your default preset, you would always need to go down here, click on the different ones that you want to use, maybe something like this, and then you need to set up your settings the way that you want them. In my case, where they're already turned on and already there, I don't have to worry about that. That just saves me half a second. But if you're thinking about how many EQs you use within one project, that is going to add up. And again, all the time that you spend doing other things is not time that you're spending on the actual creative process. So that's why those little details in terms of organization are also important. And I would highly recommend that you maybe spend an afternoon setting up a system of organization throughout all of these things that we've discussed so far, so that you have a workflow that is one, more cohesive, but also just faster for you to work with. So finally, for the end of this video, I want to go over the kind of cycle that I go through for my learning process. And that is a three-step cycle in that 1, I identify a problem with my music. 2, I devise an exercise or a process that I can use to fix that problem. And 3, I apply what I've learned into an actual production to see if it works. And that cycle is basically a continuous cycle for me. And it happens all the time, even when I'm not listening to my actual music in a production setting. I might be listening to music on, for example, headphones. I've shown these off on the channel before, but I often walk to town, which is a half-an-hour walk for me. And then I'll have these little Bluetooth headsets in, and I'll be constantly listening to not only my music, but also music from others, and see what am I doing differently, what can I maybe improve when I'm listening to other people's music, what can I hear in my own productions when I'm listening to my own productions, what issues, and those things kind of go into this cycle all together and see. And what I'll do is I'll assign the biggest priority to the biggest problem, and then from there I'll devise an exercise that I can use to actually fix that problem, or process that I can walk through to fix that problem. And then from there, once I have the time to actually produce, which unfortunately is not a lot of time lately, but still once I have the time to actually produce, I'll take that time and I'll apply the process a few times to see if the process that I have come up with actually works. Now this sounds very abstract, and that the reason for that is because it's not something that is 1, 2, 3 reproducible for everybody, in the sense that your way of learning is definitely different than my way of learning. But the basis is all the same, in the sense that we're all trying to identify the problem, see where how the problem can be solved, and then actually solving the problem. So now that we've talked about all of those things and all of the processes that you can use to actually improve your music, the final thing that I want to leave you with is an exercise that you can do regarding that last approach of finding a problem, finding a solution, and then applying the solution. What I would want you to do as an exercise is, for the next, I would say 30 days or something, actually keep a list. Maybe every day you find one problem in your production and find a solution to that problem. Now that solution can be described in text form. You might be able to put in a link to a certain YouTube video. You might be able to put in a link to a certain plugin that might solve the problem for you, whatever that you're working with. But just keep like track of all the problems that you're encountering on a day or one day, and then all of the solutions that you can come up with. I would say at least one a day, but you might find more problems in one day and fewer problems in the other. There might be a few days that you're just not producing or not listening to your music at all, just taking rest, which is also a good idea. But what I've done is I've actually created within my Discord server a specific channel called Exercises, which I'm showing here. As you can see, it's completely empty. So if you want to do this exercise, first of all, just write it in this channel, and then once in a while just keep us updated with your file. And that way what you can do is you can look at other people's struggles, other people's problems and solutions, and we can kind of create a large list of problems and solutions that you're encountering. I'm going to try to keep myself to this for at least one problem a day, but then as we get more and more into it, we'll probably find solutions from other people that you can use, and all of that. What I would like you to do is just discuss it within this exercises list. Yeah, this is going to be it for the video. For this exercise, if you want to partake in this exercise, you do need to join my Discord server. There's a link again in the description to do that. You would also need a Discord account, which is easy to get. Most people have it nowadays. But yeah, this is also the best way to communicate with me. If you have ideas for videos, whatever, then you can just all put it in here. I am going to be renovating maybe my Discord server a little bit. There might be some other ideas coming in there. But for now, this is where you would contact me. Finally, I do want to say that this video took me a while to record as well as prepare. There were a lot of topics that I wanted to cover, and I've tried my best to keep it short and concise and consumable and not too long. It is going to be probably over an hour long. If I'm looking at the time I've been recording, I can see over 1.5 hours of recording time. So that's a lot longer than I usually do. But I still try to keep it relatively small. But yeah, if you did enjoy the video, please leave a like and a subscribe. Also leave a comment with your opinion if any of these tips help you a lot. And as I said, I highly recommend that you first watch this video to its entirety, which if you're here, you've hopefully done, and then go back once in a while just to look at certain parts of the video so you can kind of refresh yourself on some of the ideas that I've explained in this video. So that's going to be it. I hope you enjoyed, and I hope this video helps you a lot in furthering your music production skills. But that's going to be it for this video, and hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye.